is just to reflect a little on each other's experiences with the project and on the presentations, and then we can open it up to everyone.
I wrote a few things down during the first presentation, frankly, so that it would help me lead into my presentation, but I was noticing some of the similarities either in learning points or aspects of the work to date that made sense to me in the context of this project and our organisation. And if I'll just touch on them briefly. I suppose the first thing, and I tried to say it, was the point about leadership in respect of seeing the opportunity. I think Eve kindly talked about the vision in terms of seeing the opportunity this project offered in the context of the work that I think we've individually tried to lead within our own organisations. There's something about, therefore, the aspects of leadership for me is something about being brave enough to take it,
yes,
brave enough to push it through. The value comment, or that you can't underestimate taking into a board environment the cost of this project versus something else. If you look at any other consultancy type arrangement for the sort of input that we're getting, the value of this is not to be underestimated, I suppose. The second one was why ICOS, and the things that you highlighted around academic rigour, the variety of methodologies, and particularly bringing complexity thinking, chimed with me in the sense of we're very different organisations in terms of the makeup of the people. Engineers versus healthcare, people who are who want to make things happen in that system. But actually, what we both knew about our organisations is it would demand academic rigour, it would demand an underpinning and clarity of why that methodology. But complexity made a lot of sense. My version, I suppose, of complexity versus the thinking that you brought to us, that complexity thinking made sense in the scope of our organisations. I think something I said around structure versus relationship. I think that you made the point about, I think we both made the point about not wanting to restructure, yes, and seeing already within the organisation the value of the relationships and what that does versus what a piece of paper says about structure, and sort of knowing, because you do know, because of the field we work in, that structure isn't the solution. So mergers and acquisitions made sense to me in that I think we were just talking over tea around we merge willy-nilly, we acquire other organisations, we are employing bodies within this family of NHS, and it has to make financial sense to do that. Now I know it's completely different ball games in terms of probably maybe the approach to that, and we're playing within a closed market, I suppose, in a much more closed market, but it did make sense in terms of dealing with change in a merger and acquisitions environment, what this offers, what this framework can offer. The nature of people needing as an organisation to capture both the entrepreneurial as well as the traditional. The sense, I suppose, in Kate's, in Landscape of the Mind, it will be you need globetrotters. You need an organisation that values and recognises the skills across all of that globe. It's not to say, well, we completely change our development and recruitment policies in order to get better at green, and deliberately make an effort to just recruit all of the greens versus the orange and versus blues. It's about trying to recognise and value what you've got in your organisation and make the development fit to that. You need entrepreneurs, you need traditionalists, you've got different audiences, different customer bases to talk to. I didn't talk about this earlier, but the sense I had of yours, the OD programme that's already in place. This isn't the only OD intervention, if I can use OD as the right term in this context. There are lots of other things perhaps we're leading within our organisations that you would say were interventions around culture, around people change, around recruiting, attracting, rewarding, developing our people. And this is, for me, it's one piece of the jigsaw. It's a very significant piece of the jigsaw, and actually it can start to be a framework for it. But I certainly didn't give you a flavour of all the other things that are going on, and maybe we should do the sense of this is a part of an organisation's effort
That's right.
in its development and transformation, its transition.
Yes.
I'll stop in a minute. The holy grail of organisational design made a lot of sense to me, because I think maybe as people working in this sort of HR field, that is, you know, that and the metrics, you know, demonstrating the benefit of the HR intervention, whatever that is, seem to be important. And lastly, it was I think we were saying the same thing around landscape of the mind actually turned into something which made it very easy to break into the whole, if I can call it that, the framework being of complexity thinking. Landscape of the mind has been a really good tool to enable people of the organisation to be interested in it, to seek it out, to look for more feedback, to consider their development needs, and then start to open up. Well, how does this fit with the rest of the complexity thinking? For me, it's very much been something that people have sought out, been curious about, challenged, wouldn't fill in the questionnaires, you know, argued about, but actually has helped break us into the broader question about complexity and the organisation and co-evolution for something sustainable around our work. So, sorry, I just because I wanted to know.
Fantastic, thank you.
Just about sums it up. I agree with all of that. I had all of those points and one other. No, just a very minor point. The power of language was one that you particularly came up against. You know, what was meant by process. For us, it was what was meant by system, because we were looking to move from being a seller of products to a seller of systems.
Yes.
But when you got people to have a few drinks in the bar, they'd say, "So exactly what is a system then?" You know, it's that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, and that was why we spent quite a bit of time going over some of the language in the PowerPoint presentation. So that is quite important, getting that common language, particularly where you've got multinational culture. You know, it means one thing in one language, it means something else somewhere else, and you've got to be careful about that. That was all very comprehensive, I think. Yeah.
Les?
Was that it? That was your only other.
That was my contribution.
So I agree with all of those comments. I think for me, the striking bit with the Modernisation Agency was the fact that a lot of the surprises that you were getting and the correlation between the tools was as you know, it was there for you. It was there for us in Rolls-Royce. And you know, the landscape of the mind, being able to use that to talk about all sorts of issues, you know, strategic direction, you know, have you got the right sort of preferences in a particular group of people to achieve, you know, a task that they've been given, I think was very strong. And the triangulation of all the tools, you know, it worked very well within Rolls-Royce Marine. And I'm pleased to hear that it worked in the Modernisation Agency as well.
Great, thank you very much. Do you want to add anything, Kate? I am not bringing up the rear after all. I think we better open it. Yes, I think we need to hear from the floor.
Talking of use of language, I want you to just tell me a little more about triangulation. Is it more than simply correlation between a number of different tools?
We use the term quite loosely, actually. And what we really mean is how do we validate one set of findings with another set of findings. I think that's important, because if we were to have something quite different from the interviews than we would have from LOM or from NetMark or whatever, you know, something would be seriously wrong there.
And is that simply a kind of manual process, or is there another triangulation tool that I've missed somewhere?
No. It is the process that we go through in analysing everything together.
I suppose there's something about validating what you already know, because actually you do know this stuff.
Yes.
It's sometimes very difficult to talk about it, either in some settings, but over a drink, in social settings, it's very easy to talk about it. People are quite happy to say, and this really naffs me off, and this is great about the place. And it's almost a process for validating quite often what you know. I think one of the other benefits, though, was that sense of mirror, because whilst we know it, it's amazing how much you do say, well, we've known that forever, and it just isn't going to change. So let's just park it over there for a moment, and we will focus on this. It does make you unpack the things that you don't particularly want to, even though you know them.
That's right.
I think it stems from the world of surveying, doesn't it? Land surveying, where you take a series of readings, form a triangle to check that you actually are where you think you are, and then when you get to where you want to be, you know, you actually are there, sort of thing. So it's just making sure that you've got a fix on your position, kind of thing, through taking readings from different directions.
It works very well with the underlying assumptions, because obviously you derive the underlying assumptions from what you've heard in the interviews, and you can then, if you take landscape of the mind, for example, say, well, we've derived an underlying assumption that everyone wants to be told what to do, for example, and then you look at the landscape of the mind and say, well, for this population, you know, that actually, with these preferences, that's right.
Or not as the case
Or not as the case may be. Yeah.
I also think it's true that different people respond to different kinds of tools. So landscape of mind will make sense to some people, it'll be of very little interest to others, but NetMap will really speak to other people, and so on. So it's also a way of trying to take account of the various different ways of engaging with these issues that people bring.
Yes.
I think what's been said is very comprehensive and it's very powerful. In some ways very simple, but in many ways also very complex and complicated. What would you say were the limitations of this approach when you sort of said how powerful it is and how useful it is? And what is it cannot do? To me it seems it's partly about organisational survival through the process of adaptation and change and response. Now, if you look at the modernisation agency as an example, it hasn't survived. Therefore, the question is, what is it that's missing from that? Using this sort of bottom-up approach suggests there's also, you've got to look up as well. No good just looking below, because if your organisational survival is affected by government and there's things happening there, there should be, that methodology needs to be moved upwards as well to understand what the broader context in which you're operating, in which you may disappear or be strengthened, or to adapt to changing the environments you do survive.
Carol, do you want to? I'll answer that, but I think if you'd like to.
I suppose there's two things that strike me, and I would say this. I suppose we're not disappearing, but absolutely critical that the people that we've skilled up and that have the talent and the passion to do this stay within the system, and we don't lose them. Part of what we're talking about is we don't lose them to other companies and to other sectors. It's got to stay within the NHS to continue to, I suppose, continue that improvement movement. That's what we're starting to talk about. In terms of, I suppose, the broader system, yes. In a way, you can't necessarily look at this work and this framework for us. It's very, you can't look at it in isolation of you and your organisation without considering the space that you occupy, in fact. And clearly, our space is the factors that will influence that significantly are political. I suppose I come back to different audiences and what they want, and if there was one thing we would do different is buy back 2 years and do the work we've done now on what we're calling the improvement dividend, which is a set of metrics around the value of the work that we're doing. But that's me with a sort of hang on to the modernisation agency. If I'm true actually to my word around localising, this improvement dividend metrics work that we've done will actually live, well, it is going to live in the system. The Treasury are buying it, ministers are buying it, so it will secure funding for improvement for the future. I suppose lastly, it's not the only bit of the jigsaw. If we went into John Reid or any of the other ministers or even Prime Minister's delivery unit with this, I'm not interested, because we haven't put pounds and pence attached to this. We haven't said the impact of the ICOS work equals this. And I think there's something about perhaps taking the work we've done on metrics and applying it to this framework in order to make it a currency for the system, and maybe then the Treasury and others would be interested in it. But again, I think it goes back to that point about audiences and what messages they're looking for, which would be very different to what this work offers in the context of an organisation and its development.
I mean, Terry gave us one figure, but which was just a partial figure. But in fact, do you remember once in a lift we tried to work out the likely value, which was quite significant if it had been in terms of contribution. But I think there's something beyond that, and I'd like to answer your questions in terms of the limitations of the approach. One very strong limitation is if people don't want to do it.
It needs an enabling environment.
It does. There is no way that we can go into an organisation and actually impose anything that we do. If there isn't, that's why I talked at the beginning about a natural experiment, meaning that the people there actually want to explore alternatives. You cannot impose it, and I see that as the major limitation of the approach.
We had lots of people that refused, that just didn't buy into this at all. The email traffic to Kate around her questionnaire, it was probably the simplest, shortest one, if I can frame it in that way. But there were lots of people who were challenging this theory, challenging this approach right from the start. Critical limitation was our chief executive bought into it, and the fact that I and a few others around the board bought into it also helped. So people need to do it, but also there needs to be a good strength of leadership, I think, because actually that then started to create a ripple within the organisation that was, they're interested, he's done it, you've done it. And then the social networks that sort of say, it's dead easy, just get on with it. And it's really interesting. That as a dynamic was just something I suppose you just have to take a ride. You sort of, intuition, that the organisation's ready for it. And it's making sure that the power and the leadership plays in behind it.
I don't necessarily view this approach as being all that there is either here. I think there's scope for development of it, to incorporate the use of other tools, techniques and different methodologies. You go to any of the big consultancies and they'll have a whole range of performance diagnostics, questionnaires, surveys, approaches that you can use, and I think you can supplement this approach with some of that and the reverse. So what you've got is a sort of menu, I think, that you can pick from to go forward. To answer your question about what it won't do, it won't solve third world hunger, it won't sort out the Middle East peace process, but before you get to that sort of stage, there's a hell of a lot of really quite tricky problems, I think, within organisations that you can use this approach to help you get a grip on and to deal with. The other thing I think that's worth saying is that it's possible that you could achieve the same end by different means. We could have gone through a different process, working with an Accenture, a McKinsey, a PricewaterhouseCoopers, and have arrived at the same, similar, or even a better solution. I don't know. That's possible. There's all sorts of different ways of boiling an egg, or whatever the expression is. That probably isn't the expression, is it? Skinning a cat, I like is the one. Yes. Not to split hairs, of course, but I think it isn't necessarily the only approach that you could take to get to the end result. But it's an approach that just felt right and seemed to work for us.
Just to carry on from what Terry said, because that question was asked at the Willis workshop. Can you use any other, why this particular tool, and can you use any others? And of course the answer is, of course you can use any other tool you want, as long as the logic of complexity underpins them. So the ones we're using at the moment happen to be the appropriate ones that we have at hand. But there are others that we can use. What you cannot get away from is since we are using with complexity, that it doesn't contravene the logic and the principles of complexity. And a couple of other points. One on the political side. I've just spent a weekend preparing a report for Caroline that will in due course feed into the report that she's doing to go into ministers. Now I hope that some of that thinking, it might find its way into there, so it might have. And you said it cannot do anything about third world hunger. Well, actually, we are talking with an organisation who are dealing with the extremely poor around the world, and what they would like us to do is to work with some of those teams in Africa, South America, India, to try and see if there is, how do they set up the projects? They work very much with children. They focus on the children of the very poor. Is there any way, how did they set up the projects? Can we build an enabling frameworks that other teams do not then have to start from zero? They can actually use some of the learning and build it in their own context. So there may still be...
No, I take it all back.
Nothing
Yes,
about the
yes.
Middle East piece.
Yeah.
Please elaborate a bit on the interview techniques and the content now, if we do it.
Okay, yes, thanks. That's a good question. Thank you, because in fact I didn't have time to explore it. And I think it's important to understand that process, because it is very important not to have interpretation bias in how we interpret the findings. And just very briefly, to take you through the process, for example, with the Modernization Agency, because this is the most recent, there were 4 researchers working on it. So we all did the interviews. We then analyzed them by each person analyzing some of the interviews that she did. We're all 4 women, so I can say she quite comfortably, that she did, and some that she didn't do, so that every interview was analyzed by a minimum of 2 people and never the same pairs. So we have quite a sort of complicated method of working out who interviewed. We do that individually. We will then come together and spend 1, 2, 3, 4 days brainstorming, trying to understand what those themes are, what those other dilemmas are, the questions, the key questions. And that is a very intensive process. By the time we finished, it is very, very exhaustive. I mean, it really is a very deep understanding, because we will each come from a different perspective. By doing it against each other, it means we're minimizing interpretation bias. And then, of course, we validated through the Reflect Back workshop, we validated through the one-to-one feedbacks, we validated through the constant discussions and interactions that are happening. So it is a very rich process that takes place, and does that answer part of your question?
Yes.
Just to
I just wanted to say,
Yeah.
you use the softwares like Moody's or the other ones.
Right, let me ask the 2 researchers, which software do you use?
I use Atlas to analyze.
Do you use Atlas as well, you? Yes. So they use Atlas, but Kate and I and Nazreen don't. We do it the old-fashioned way with pen and paper. But then what happens? I mean, I am very experienced now, and it still takes me a minimum of half a day to do 1 interview, and that's the first pass analysis. So in effect, it will take me 1 whole day to just analyze 1 interview in depth. By the time I've written it all up, because once we've done it, and then go through and cluster the themes and so on. But can you say how you use the Atlas?
I don't know how many people are familiar with it. It's a software package that supports the analysis of data, and basically you put in the document, and then you can go through the document, you read the document, and you basically do what you can also do by hand. You can put the themes, and what it does is that by the end of it, when you've done like 10 interviews, you have all the themes clustered, and it also has the quotes. So if you want to say, okay, who talked about, I don't know, roles and responsibilities, you get who talked about it and what the quotes were. So then basically you can use that to write a document.
So you're sort of thinking software.
Oh yes.
Oh yes.
So, yeah, the thing about the software package is none of them do. It just helps you to organize
Yes.
the data. That's all.
Yes. The thinking always happens in the human's head. Yes.
Sorry, just if I could just ask a bit more about I understood there are 8 open questions related to the theme.
No, not relating to the overall theme, the trigger questions.
They're not theme, they're just open questions. They're not around a theme or
They are open. They are primarily trigger questions to open up specific areas that we want to explore. And we have our sort of basic 8. But what we will always do is ask our sponsors if they want to substitute or add 1 or 2. And in both cases, they wanted to focus on something specific. So we would adopt the approach to make it much more specific. But they are never in terms of facts and figures. They are more, what is it that you think about the objectives of the organization, shall we say? How far do you think it has achieved them? What still needs to be done? If you were to look into the future, what is it that you would like to see happen? So they are very much, what is your perspective? How do you read it? What does it mean to you?
But the overall theme, we could say, is change.
Yes.
So it's the theme of change, and in Rolls-Royce, for example, it was change and the matrix and the roles and responsibilities.
Yeah.
With that language.
So if that's what you meant, yes. So, yeah.
So just a rather detailed point, really, on the question of language. Here we come back to language, which is like, I know I made the mistake once of taking down things that people are saying and interpreting as I put it down, which is a complete no-no, because people don't know enough. Where did that come from? I didn't write that, you know. And so how do you actually hang on to the language that people gave you?
Yes.
Do you...
That's easy. We use these mini discs.
Yeah.
We record everything and work from transcriptions. We do not do it from notes, because notes are always an interpretation. That's your first interpretation, because you're not going to take that. How people use the language is very, very important. We have to listen to precise, not just to what they said, but how they said it. Because if you remember earlier, I said what is between the lines is as important as what they actually say. So you have to become skilled to listen to what people don't say.
But there's a point where, obviously, you can't work with a disc, with a whole day's recording or whatever it is. And there's a point, your 4-day brainstorming, you're somehow synthesizing things from this process. And do you have to be very careful there to hang on to the original language? Or?
Yes. That's why we use quotations to illustrate.
One way the analysis of the interviews was first presented to us was simply, I say simply, to cluster the quotes in terms of dilemmas, assumptions, and by just pulling them together in that way, it enabled an interpretation, but it wasn't an interpretation offered. It was a clustering of the quotes to then, in order to reflect back to us, this is what we'd said, and the simple approach to cluster them in that way helped in the interpretation.
Yeah. So ultimately, it's really at the reflective backstage that becomes refined in some way.
It goes through a constant refining process, but not on our own. It's
only the company that can really change the language or synthesize it or move it to a higher level.
Yeah. It's making sense, really. It's very much a sense-making exercise. Yes, but yeah.
That was a
All right.
question.
I think you said that sometimes the clients, the organisation, come up with a problem, but later on you realise that that's not the problem. When you start asking the questions, you start from defined problem.
We will yes, we have to focus on that initial problem, but because of the nature of the questions, we will we will explore the area around it. Because if we were to focus too narrowly, we may not get... In other words, we're working with emergence. We really are working with emergent patterns. And that is very important, and that is why, although you start from that area, you have to expand it and explore it.
Because my worry is that if you start with that, then you are directing
Yes.
the thinking.
That's right.
And then, as you said, the problem may be something else.
Yes.
But,
Yes.
you've already biased the thinking of the interviewee.
Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, Yurush.
If I can add to that, to answer today's questions, you asked earlier about themes. I mean, I think overall we looked at what enables and inhibits, change. So we had a broader idea in mind. So not only was a problem considered, but that overall catch was looked at. So that we looked at it in terms of communication or whatever it was. And ideas of enables and inhibitors. So we're still sticking with the research projects original goal, which in itself changed throughout the time.
Yes.
So that was one way of methodologically getting through problem solving.
Yes. Yes, the whole thing evolved through its 3-year quite significantly.
Is there a natural conclusion of complexity theory that the size of businesses should be sort of limited? Because although we've had examples of 1 million people in an organisation, 7,000 people within an organisation, in fact, with the net mapping and things like that, it seems to me that one conclusion would be that most people can only handle so many relationships, be them social, organisational, etc., and they feel most comfortable when their boundaries are set within that number. Is that some way that you're all going? Is that thoughts that come?
Yeah, do you want to comment before
There's,
I answer?
the
I think it's
tipping
a very
point,
good question.
Yes.
I don't know the answer, unfortunately.
There's some the tipping point suggests 150. The sort of the boundary around which teams will know teams, people will know people. As soon as you get above 150, you lose that. And there's something around the tipping point around keeping an organisation that small or a unit that small in order to maximise what that unit can do. That's as much as I know.
Yeah. Now, thank you very much for that, because this is very good. In fact, what we see happening is that you do not have to limit size. What you do have to do is rethink how an organisation structures itself. And we keep finding that networks are the thing that organizations are beginning to explore now. And it comes very much around that 150 to 200 actually is the figure. And very interestingly, Gerard Fairclough, who is the next seminar, wrote a book many years ago about this very thing, where he set up an organization on that very principle of the 150 to maximum 200, the idea of the cell. He had the metaphor, or the analogy of the cell, and then it would start another cell if it became larger. And we find that happening a lot with networks, so that it's how organizations are made up now that is changing, not necessarily saying you can't have more than 7,000 or 10,000 or 1 million. You can have a very large organizations as long as you have the small local grouping, but even that grouping does not remain small and local. It is networked with other grouping, and it's how these networks spread throughout the organization. So that's what we see happening. And it fits in with the theory. Hold on a minute, I think that Malcolm had...
You know the elevator pitch thing for you're an entrepreneur, you're stuck in an elevator with a venture capitalist, you've got, as long as that elevator's got to get to the floor he's getting out on, to guessing 16 words, I think. 16 words, right, okay. And then we need for a different kind of elevator pitch. The project was part of a programme conceived by a bunch of engineers. And they persuaded EPSRC to crop up 20 million thereabouts. And this was just one project in it. Now, although it was a bunch of engineers, they did accept and recognise that they needed to understand organisational integration and its knock-on consequences for technical systems. Now, I'm stuck in the picture of the chief executive of EPSRC, wholly handled engineering types. They're hard science, they want to know what's the contribution to knowledge from these projects. And I'm stuck with him, he says, you've just wasted all my money. I've got 16 words, I've got the elevator time,
to say, well, no, what we discovered was that. What's the answer, Eve? Terry?
Yes.
Well, this is like I can't do it in 16 words, I dare say. I've already used up those already, haven't I? I would work something around that this is an approach that worked for us. And I don't make any further claims than that, personally. And in a sense, it's your problem to worry about that bigger picture. Yeah, but it is certainly an approach that came along at the right time, and we worked within this framework, and it worked for us, has delivered some very useful benefits to our organisation.
By changing the emphasis, which is what you said earlier, and I think
I could elaborate on it, but I'm keeping it short. So it worked for us.
Yes, I think it's changing a way of thinking is the way I would put it, and changing it in a way that at least for these organisations worked.
And that whole business about it having worked for whatever that means, in many ways very different organisations, also says something perhaps about its value.
So maybe what we need to do is characterise what it is.
Yeah, there may be something generic here, which,
Yes.
an approach that can be applied in a lot of different types of organisations, maybe.
Can I add something on that? Because
Yeah.
I'm not part of the project. It has given you something that it will work no matter what the changes in the environment will be in the future. Because you have already the flexibility and all those mechanisms that will help your companies adapt to any new change.
The only bit that's missing is paying attention to there's something around leadership. There's something about recognising patterns, which I think all of these tools do. I think it's the process, the methodology that you go through, and for us it seems to have worked that it does that point about triangulation. It helps reinforce it. But there is something about having, you do still need at the end of the day leadership and power, some sort of power-based sign-up to this that you don't necessarily see from the work of the project. I suppose it's implicit in terms of you can find it within the long patterns.
Just want to go back to the gentleman's question here, who was asking really about sort of the end point, if you allow emergent theories to sort of take hold. I'm interested in, if you do go down, allow this to happen, so we do reflect the sort of cell-like structure and the emergent quality. Just what happens to accountabilities in that, responsibilities? Do they tend to become clearer for the individual, or actually do those become more sort of less bounded, more fluid?
Okay, I'll let the others talk for them. One organisation we didn't mention today is the Humberside Training and Enterprise Council. Now they use these ideas over several years, and in fact they were using them almost before we started working with them. And what they found was that it changed the organisation quite dramatically, and it brought in very, very sharp accountability and responsibility. It allowed so much freedom for the individual to explore their own boundary, but it meant that they had to carry responsibility for their actions on behalf of the organisation. The chief exec said, you can bind the organisation, but don't sink the ship. And that you could see it from right through the organisation, how everyone was taking part in a very active way to make this organisation successful. Now, I don't know if you are familiar with what training and enterprise councils used to do, which is they used to work in a particular geographic area and work with all the companies, from the very small to the very large in their area, in terms of training investors in people, etc., etc. And therefore, even though they were fairly small, their effect, their impact was huge because it covered an entire geographic area. So this is what they were doing. So they were constantly, these few individuals, there are about 150, They were exploring new ways of doing this job and creating value for their customers, I suppose, in quotation marks. And that became very, very successful indeed. But to go back to your point, it was a very, very significant increase in responsibility and accountability. Now, that did not suit everyone. And some people actually left because they could not work in an area where your boundaries are not set for you, where you have very tight structures. And that is something else that happens if you're working with the theory sort of at full gallop. The structures become very relaxed and so on, but there are other things that come in where you have peer support as well as peer pressure. The dynamics change completely. And what was even more interesting is because there were, 70 odd techs throughout the UK, so they were just one of many, so they were within a civil service background. And they had to be almost schizophrenic in their approach. They had one approach internally and with their people in Humberside, and another with the civil service masters. So they would give them the figures and facts that they wanted and then put them in a drawer and not use them internally at all. But they learned how to play the game and actually give their masters what they actually needed to leave them alone and get on with it. And they were one of the most successful because they actually did take a test in terms of benchmarking, just to see how they did, because they were being criticized that, you have it easy, etc., etc. And what they found was astonishing. They came at the top of practically everything. They were the most effective, the most efficient, the most cost efficient, etc., etc. And it was wonderful. It was astonishing.
It's not written up as a case study anywhere.
Pardon?
It's not written up as a case study.
We're writing it. We're writing it. Yes.
Oh, right.
Yes.
So how can we get hold of it when it's done?
Well, as soon as it's done, it will go on our website. But it is being done as we speak. Yes. Did you want to, by the way, comment on?
I've just written down a few things here. I think it's a really complex issue here. It's a whole bunch of trade-offs in my mind that probably come in here. You go for the smaller type of organisational unit, you get a lot more clarity of accountability and responsibility, you get a lot more focus potentially. Maybe the speed of decision making might be faster, closeness to your customer, all of that kind of stuff, but then you trade that off against potentially economies of scale and economies of skill. Also in terms of having a large centre of excellence type of approach, you might lose economies in terms of market share and market power by going for smaller units. So I think it's hard for me to generalise. That's just kind of off the top of my head thinking there, but I think it's kind of hard to generalise as to what is optimal. I think you have to look at the precise set of circumstances and then work it out.
I'd like to just add a point onto that. I think when you look at large organisations, a lot of people shy away from responsibility because they don't feel that they know, or they have a support network, or that they know, sort of what's going on and how to access information. And I think if you, one of the things that we looked at was how to develop those relationships, develop the networks. And if people feel that they have that support structure, it's not implicit in the organisation chart in the hierarchy, or they go to their boss doesn't have a clue either. But if they've got that network, then my experience is that people take the responsibility and they feel much more happier to make decisions because they can use the network to do so.
Okay. Yes. Well, I had quite a number. You've put your hands down now, yes.
Yes. I have talked to some of the guys here, and one of the problems that, in relation to the questions which were asked before, is that complexity and complex evolving system is a metaphor. It's a biological metaphor, and applying that to human organizations ignores the politics and the power relationships within the organization, and is another managerial tool to impose change.
Discuss.
Okay.
That's whenever,
Yes.
I
Yes.
personally, when I I'm teaching it and I
Yes.
talk about it, and then that's what I always
Okay,
get
that
as
is
a
where I
response
think
reaction.
we need to sort of have different perspectives in terms of complexity, because I do not see complexity either as a metaphor or as an analogy. Organizations are are complex evolving systems in their own right. You don't need to use the ideas as a metaphor or an analogy. The whole point is, how do they operate as complex systems? If you don't understand that, if you don't understand their characteristics as complex systems, you cannot get to it through the analogy route, because you press an analogy or a metaphor far enough and it breaks down, and it does not take you very far. You look at it as a complex system in its own right, then you can explore it in greater depth. So that is where I think we would have the different perspective. There was one other point you made. What was it?
I said the power relationship.
Oh, power relationship. No, I disagree. I think, but the power relationship, actually also the leadership relationships are very much part of it, because part of the thing that would come through is how do you actually, again, facilitate the distributed leadership and distributed power within the organization. And that's the other thing we're seeing, greater distribution of power. The power politics are changing. They're changing quite fundamentally, and there's greater distribution.
So in a way, hierarchy disappears.
Hierarchy is changing quite dramatically. Euros is trying to get in.
Well, on the comment of power and politics, Andrea has some comments as well. I agree that it's not explicit in the way a lot of the literature speaks about complexity and hierarchy. But I will also agree that to some extent it is alluded to, but I do think work needs to be done to articulate it that there are interdependencies, that bottom up is something that is, screamed about but not done. And organizational politics and work in that area has been done quite a bit, but its linking needs to be more sharpened. So I don't know, both those points. And I wanted to say something earlier about, actually I had a question, but I don't know if it's a place to ask. I wanted to ask our partners over there, as a person who's worked on this project, for 2 years and been on every step of the way, and in my interest in furthering the theoretical development and sharpening our methodology, what did you find, in a few comments if possible, useful about our complexity approach and not so useful, compared to other things that you've done in the past, other approaches or methodologies? I don't know. You have just a few words, just in interest of our sharpening, how we use this approach.
What was useful and what was not useful? Yeah. Well, overall, I think I've given the impression that the whole thing was useful, but it is kind of forcing me to pick a particular piece of it. I would say that probably the analysis was for me probably the key bit that for me is the most difficult piece to manage. You get all this huge amount of data, and how do you make sense of it? And it was going through what I described earlier as that sort of funneling process to get something meaningful that you could actually then work with. That for me was probably the most useful. With agent-based modelling, I think there's a lot of scope there, but we're only exploring it at the moment. I think it's potentially a very useful tool. A net map, I agree with the comments that were made earlier, that is very, very powerful. Again, we only started to explore with it, but it's obvious that there is potentially enormous power there. But we didn't get, in terms of our project, much value out of ABM and NetMap because they're still quite sort of developmental, I suppose, really, in terms of being used in these sorts of operational activities.
I suppose for us, if you have to categorise it in that way as useful and not useful, then I think we're right at the point of stepping back and saying, what is this data and what are we going to use it for? So I think we're just on the cusp of perhaps going through that funneling process. And I sort of sense, and perhaps reinforced by your presentation today, that true value is just about to come out of that. Where we've seen it is the power lies in the triangulation, the power lies in the opportunity of the analysis of the variety of the tools. if it's, I suppose I'm struck by how it feels difficult to express your organisation to anybody, I suppose, to people that you're inviting in a very intimate way, to say, come and look at us, come and help us and mirror us and help us reflect on our position. It's always difficult to try and convey that story to an adequate level or depth when time, money and diaries will always get in the way. So there is a continual conflict over the time that you expect from us and that we expect from you, and a continual dance around, I suppose, trying to offer the right thing in both ways. Because, in effect, you see and you have experience of working with other organisations, the sense of either time that's needed or brain space or head space that's needed. And we're constantly pushing back, saying, I haven't got the time, money's a problem, diaries are well in the way, and by the way, you're up for an argument with anybody if you come in and talk theory, because we'll throw 5 other theories back at you. The sort of, we've had that all the way through, all the way through. This is just, it's not just this is a management tool. We haven't had that one, but on the outskirts of it, because we're just about to go through, you know, the whole dissolution process. But it's more the, fine, you've got a framework, I've got a better one. You've got a framework, well, I'm working with 5 organisations where we're doing it this way. You've got a better, I've got a better, you know, we are an organisation that's promoting improvement in the NHS with 1 million people. You're coming up with this framework, well, what's that? Why isn't mine better than yours? So there feels a continual battle to sort of support the framework that maybe we're not showing you as a battle at this stage. So it's sort of, I don't think I'm expressing that very well as doing better or what's most valuable. It's all valuable. It's just when it happens, how it happens, and the power, you know, what's going on at the time.
The constraints, really.
It's the other things that are going on in the organisation at the same time. Yes. Certainly from my experience, I mean, one thing that worked really well was using the internal resource alongside, you know, sort of the LSE to do the research, because one of the things that that Eve knows that I wrestled with an awful lot at the beginning was trying to apply the tools, and some of them were easier to apply than others. And I think if you don't have that business knowledge as part of the team that's trying to do this, then you run the risk of having a tool, you know, you're taking a file to hammer a nail in.
Yeah.
So in its own right, it's a good tool, but it's not appropriate for what you're looking at. Yeah. And so I think there has to be a close correlation between the business or the user, if you like, or the person that knows the organisation, knows what goes on, against the, you know, the academic, the methodology, and the theory side.
I'd like to mention landscape of the mind before we move off this, mainly because Kate's close enough to hit me if I don't. We did get quite a bit of value out of that. We're continuing to work with Kate, both at an individual level with our middle management group that we're looking to develop, so individual development being on the agenda, but also collectively looking at the outputs for that group together with the senior management group in terms of what organisation development and collective development needs there might be for the organisation. So that again is useful. I must believe that, or we wouldn't be working with her still.
Well, Andrea has been, yes.
Actually, I have a different question, which more applies to the operationalization of the case studies, which I do now know more better now, but not as intimately as you. And there's one question when we're talking about empowerment and bottom-up approaches that I'm interested in, but it's more like a research question I propose. I don't have the answer. Maybe from your experience you have an answer to that. Is the question of contingency management, because we're talking about the responsibility to the individual. What I'm specifically interested in employee well-being, because this is one variable that I research in my part-time work as a research assistant, and stress levels and the drivers influencing it. And I am interested in how contingency affects employee well-being.
What do you mean by contingency?
Contingency meaning that you have less in a structure that tells you how to organize your work.
Right.
Meaning it gives you more ambiguity as to how you carry out your work, what you think is expected, and what you will be accountable against tomorrow.
Yeah.
And some of the
literature suggests that you do need a certain level of structure for your personal well-being and satisfaction in your position, in your job, so there's something you can measure yourself against. It seems objective somehow. And so I was just wondering what your experience once you've implemented these tools, which are also parliamentary. Because you were talking about the results of your case study, and you were all out with rivals, and you didn't mention any real rivals when you were talking about it, so you didn't mention well-being.
Yeah, I've got an immediate reaction. I suppose this I suppose reinforces the point around this being a tool in a number of tools, and part of a jigsaw around holding something together on behalf of the organisation. We, as one of the other pieces of the jigsaw, fairly standard employee surveys, the stress indicators within that, and measuring our year-on-year performance in that area. And there is a connection clearly with, I think there is a connection with ambiguity. I suppose my immediate thought is, I love ambiguity. I absolutely thrive on it. You know, it just, that's where I like being. Yet I've got a team of people, and you can spot the people that I, can put into a shivering wreck because I just happen to go past and say, well, by the way, can we just do this or do that? And the team that needs to be there to cope with both the behaviours of individuals, the dynamic of the team, and personal preferences. And I suppose there's something in all of that around getting it right for the team and getting it right for the individual. Knowing if you're getting it right as an organisation, and the tools and techniques you can employ to answer that question, and then being alert and deliberate around any interventions that you're taking within the organisation, what impact do they have, either on individual, team, or whole organisation, on well-being, on reward. It's that sort of part of the jigsaw stuff. That would be my immediate reaction.
Yeah, I agree with pretty much all of that. I think that there is probably a very close link between stress levels and high levels of ambiguity in an organisation. Just probably an observation. I've got no particular evidence for that. I think that what we were seeing when we got the result at our conference in 2002 that said clarify roles and responsibilities, #1 priority, was because people were feeling a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety about the lack of clarity that was there, and it was too ambiguous a situation for them to be able to cope with. They were not comfortable with it. We have actually, again, I've got no real data on this, but I know that we have had quite high levels of stress in parts of our organisation, and we've had to take some steps in some areas to make interventions specifically around that, working with our occupational health people. But whether that's improving, I've no particular evidence, only anecdotal, but I think that it is improving as the ambiguity is reduced and people get more comfortable. I think that we're probably seeing that sort of tail off a wee bit.
Or there's something about saying, because I recognised your point earlier around the employee conference, the power of offering the vote. Yeah. People feel comfortable with that. It's anonymised, and they're up on the screen in front of 500 people, 5,000 people. This is what we want to see happen around. This is the stuff that's making us causing us concern. Yeah. Clarity of role and responsibility with us. Same thing. Employee conference. Anonymous voting, up pops the top 3 things, and you as a leadership team can't get away from that. You have to do something about it, and that sort of commitment to going back and talking to employees around this is what we think we need to be doing, these are the actions that we're taking. These are things we can't do. Actually, it's going to be a pretty tough ride for the next 2 years, and we'll keep trying to make it clear, but these are the things we can't make clear. That drops the levels of anxiety and sometimes stress, even when you start communicating well, the fact that you don't have the answers, that you can't sort everything out, that it's not all going to be clear, and a new structure chart is not the solution. Actually clarifying maybe roles and responsibilities, or indeed, for us it was, this next 12 months and will I have a job stuff. Well, we still can't tell people. And being able to act cohesively as a leadership team and be able to say, I'm sorry, we still don't know, but we'll keep telling you, and as soon as we do know something, we'll communicate it in the best way. Significantly saw, for some of the metrics that we were using, a drop in stress levels.
Kate? Can I just add to that? It seems to be the case, for instance, tolerance for ambiguity does seem to vary depending on inner skills preferences. So some people have naturally a high tolerance for ambiguity and indeed enjoy it and like the freedom that it gives, and some people don't. So it's not common across. It is worth, once people know that, then it can help to be a bit more supportive and a bit more sensitive to what the impact is likely to be. So that's one issue. Another is that stress levels co-vary with a whole lot of things, like suddenly finding that your job is at risk. But they also co-vary with the match between what the individual is being asked to do, or the team is being asked to do, and their preference profiles. So the closer the match, the higher the levels of well-being. People will feel energised, even if they're working very hard. They'll feel they are making a real contribution. You know, they can see the point of doing what they're doing. All of those kinds of things will go with that. The bigger the gap between the preference profile and what they're being asked to do, the higher the likelihood of both feeling bored and stressed. And feeling as if you're pushing a boulder up a hill, and as if it's draining, and so on. So there is a whole dimension there which links with inner skills preferences.
We need to finish actually because it's just past 4:30. I'll just very briefly say, again we saw quite distinct differences from the tech and the early stages of what happened with Rolls-Royce Marine, that were two completely different contexts and cultures. You went into a culture of an acquisition. These were people who were feeling uncomfortable. They were asked to work in a different way than they were used to, and so on. So they were not, in one sense, given permission to explore their roles and responsibilities. Their roles and responsibilities were almost given them, but without sufficient clarity as to what they were. In the tech, the exact opposite happened. They actually created the environment and the framework for people to be constantly discussing and exploring, and what do I need? What is the training do I need? What support do I need? What is it that will make this job that I need to do better? If I were pushed the boundary here, what would be the? So it was completely different. And therefore they did not get to that point that we found in the early stages. You got over that, and I think you went through that process brilliantly, and I think you addressed it. But there are different ways of doing it. In reducing that stress quite dramatically.
I was just going to ask, I'm sort of running out of time, but I thought this is just sort of almost at the crux of where this is, because if complexity is supposedly that fuzzy space on the edge of chaos, and you're going into emergence and not knowing, which I think is a very different sort of mindset or mind frame to most people working in these large organisations. We're hearing about sort of two public sector organisations now, which no longer exist, or no longer will exist in a different context. So I think it is very much about changing people's mindsets, I think is their way of thinking, as we go, because we are going forwards into the unknown. Yes. And I think a lot of what we do sometimes is wanting to make everything all right. So it can be used, I think, this is what you were saying, possibly as a defence mechanism about us facing the reality as ecologies that, we may not exist in the future in our existing state. But I think one's hearing more and more stories about this. So I think we need some tools to help us reconcile with these very difficult questions, but be careful that we aren't actually smothering the very difficult.
Exactly.
To face anxiety, which is out there for all of us.
Yes. And I think I think that's very good. And it's how do you actually face the anxiety and face it in a generative way, rather than in a way that's going to make you completely unable to cope with it.
Or denial.
Yes, exactly.
Or paralysed.
Yes.
Of the paradox, yes.
Right.
Just a very brief question. With Rolls-Royce, what was the kind of lead up to you doing what you did in terms of doing a survey? Why did that happen?
So the lead up to the
conference, I think.
Yeah, where you interviewed about 70 senior management.
Okay, well, the specific trigger, I suppose, was the fact that our senior management identified it as the number one thing that we needed to sort out. So that was the specific trigger, this clarify roles and responsibilities thing. You may recall the conference in 2002.
Where does that come from?
Where did it come from? It came from the 70 senior executives.
What triggered that?
That I think was triggered by the acquisition that had taken place and the fact that there hadn't been a proper integration plan within the business.
That was 2 years, wasn't it? 2 years after the acquisition?
Yeah, the acquisition was November 99. I joined in December 2000. The conference was May 2002. And it was very clear that you know, there'd been a very feeble attempt to properly integrate the acquisition with the existing Rolls-Royce business. And that was, I'm not sure that it's come up today, and I probably didn't make it absolutely clear earlier, but I think that was probably, you know, a major root cause, if not the root cause, of the issues. There was never a proper integration plan in there. If there had been, if it had been a good integration plan, we probably would not have found ourselves in the situation that we did find ourselves in. However, notwithstanding that, the other thing that I didn't say is that it's actually a very successful business. We've grown the business consistently since the acquisition, so it's not a basket case or anything, you know, making very good returns and year-on-year growth. But we'd just like it to be that little bit better.
So I hope the EPSRC is happy with that. Right, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you very much for coming, for participating, for making today a very, very successful and enjoyable day. And thank you all very much indeed for leading us through the day. And thank you all very much.